Hello everyone, JD here. This specific presentation is going to focus on liberalism. It has two major components. The first of which I'm going to talk a bit about the different strands of liberalism as it relates to the central assumptions. And then I'm also going to talk about case study, and this is going to be like a thread through the different presentations. I'm going to focus on proliferation and arms races. And we're going to look at the Non-proliferation Treaty, New START, Limited Test Ban Treaty, and Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, because this helps illustrate the how people who characterize themselves or categorize themselves as liberals in this, we talk about international relations, how they would look at this issue, specifically nuclear weapons. So let's get rolling. And if you hear any paper shuffling, it's because I have papers surrounding me. All right, so first of which we want to get to the central assumptions. And I want to just talk a bit about this briefly. Liberals see a world where cooperation is possible and states will pursue policies of mutual benefit, not simply self-interest. And there are three items I want to mention here. First of which is it heralds the possibility of human progress. Secondly, promotes the spread of democracy. And thirdly, argues in favor of market capitalism. I think the one word that jumps out at me when I think of liberalism as a theory in international relations is going to be cooperation. In other words, nations can work together when they have common interests in order to advance themselves. But they're not doing it unilaterally. They're doing it along with others. And there are benefits to working together in a global community. I like the term global community myself. I think that can apply here. So when you look at this idea of like human progress, in other words, people have the capacity to advance. And you're relying on others, not just yourself. The spread of democracy. In other words, democratic institutions where people are able to play a role in shaping government policy. Right? We have our own brand of democracy, a democratic republic. Other countries around the world, in England, they have their own brand of democratic institutions, and in France and in Australia and Japan and so forth, where people are afforded the opportunity to participate in the system. But it is by adopting that kind of a system, and then these countries working together, they're able to achieve policy goals. All right, and then also here, free market capitalism. In other words, opening up a market, and especially if you're a neoliberal, like opening up the market will open up a country. And you think about it, because no one country has access to all the resources. And then when you think about when a company manufactures a specific good, the company can be in one place, the factory is in another place, and then the market where the final product is sold is yet another place. So it's interesting to me, but when you read about this and you think in terms of free market or in favor of market capitalism, people operating businesses that other folks are going to work in, and then you're producing some good or service that people are going to benefit from, and that by engaging in this activity, there's like this mutual benefit across nations that reflects in different institutions. And I also want to talk about we have the different strands. We have liberal internationalism, and then we have neoliberal institutionalism, and then also for this presentation I've written, we have laissez-faire and economic liberalism. Okay, but I want to talk about, just briefly mention the liberal internationalism. It says here in the notes, school of thought embraces the assumptions that cooperation is possible even in the face of self-interest. And it's not that self-interest doesn't exist, but it's recognizing the fact that you're in a global community where you rely upon other people in order to overcome challenges, right? But also there's like this mutual benefit that when you are engaged in some kind of market, or you've instituted some kind of a market, and then people are buying and selling of goods and services, that different countries can benefit in different ways. Right. Individuals possess rational qualities. And finally here, humans can adapt and progress in their social lives. I think there's plenty of evidence of that, and I don't want to get on a tangent here, but when you adapt, there are circumstances you're confronted with, and then the question is, what do you do in response to them? And then if you find ways to advance, you have to adapt to what's going on around you, and whatever the circumstance is. And then you find ways to adjust so that you can better assert yourself and advance the interests that you have. And of course, you're doing it with liberalism, you're doing it alongside of other nations. Okay, I want to say that. And then also I want to throw in a little bit of neoliberal institutionalism here. Increased interdependence that arose after 2 world wars made the creation of international organizations easier. The wars highlighted the destructive power wrought by states, institutions created in the name of peace and security, like the United Nations. Because you think about that, as a body, countries come together. I mean, I like to think in terms of, when we talk about formal institution, you think about, for example, consider our U.S. Congress. There are people who come from respective states to Washington, D.C. When they're elected, they go there, and then they sit down and they talk about laws and resolutions, or bills, shall I say, and resolutions that will have the effect of law if they are in fact passed or enacted. But the reason why I bring this up is because I think there's a parallel there. The United Nations might operate differently, but it's still all these different countries coming together. Just like in the U.S. Congress, there's a bunch of representatives, like in the House, all coming together from different states to talk about issues. And so the United Nations brings together a bunch of countries to talk about different issues. So in that way, it is kind of like there's a parallel there. It's not exactly the same because there are no 2 institutions that are exactly the same. But I do like to think in terms of comparisons, that one makes sense to me. All right, so we got the UN. Magnifies issues that require collective solutions, as one state would be unable to correct or prevent negative consequences. So the examples I have here on the slides, environmental degradation, you think about like climate change. That's not just an issue that's relevant to any one country. It's relevant to all of us in this global community. Because when you think about, rising sea levels or the increased number of storms, or wildfires and all of this, I mean, all these different issues can have effects on different people, but we all have to deal with it. And by it, I mean climate change. Global health crises, I think about like an example, the pandemic is, I think, a given. This pandemic with COVID-19, that certainly is an important one. But I also think about like HIV/AIDS historically over the last few decades since I was a kid, right? I mean, HIV/AIDS has been a major issue, certainly. So that's a health crisis right there. And then, of course, refugees, as we've seen people leaving countries like Syria and going to places like, to different European countries. So to me, and because there's been like a civil war going on in Syria, and then there's been questions, should the United States get involved and who should be involved and which other countries are concerned about what's happening there besides the United States. I mean, these are major issues that cannot be ignored. And I would offer in here, not just refugees, I was just thinking about this too, the Arab-Israeli conflict has implications for countries other than people who live in Israel and then other people who live there who self-identify as Palestinian. So there are all kinds of issues, I think. But it's this idea of like collective solutions. And the United States has tried to play a role with the Arab-Israeli conflict. And then we've also had other instances where there's been human rights abuses. Rwanda, the United Nations was involved in Rwanda back in the 1990s, genocide. Whenever there's any kind of, one group of people is committing horrific acts of violence against another group. But there you go. Okay, global economic system has promoted cooperation in trade and development. And there's some examples here. Of course, the United States and allies promoting capitalism and free trade. Yes, and that capitalism is a big component also of the Cold War when you think about it. Because those communist dictatorships that used to exist historically, and that some of which still continue to exist, right? I mean, the Chinese government is still very autocratic. Ironically, they're pretty hyper-capitalistic in terms of the production that's going on there. But it's still an autocratic system. But, historically, we had the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics and other countries. But there was the superpowers, the USSR and the United States. And it was a global struggle, and it would flare up in different places, but the Cold War was not, it was more of an ideological struggle with occasional flashpoints of hot wars like in Vietnam or Korea or something, in the struggle between like communist dictatorships and capitalist democracies. All right, but also says here, supported by the creation of economic institutions. We have the World Trade Organization, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank. And the WTO has been a controversial body or institution, however you want to look at it. That remember back in the late 90s, there were a lot of protests over the World Trade Organization and in the years after, into the early to mid 2000s. You don't hear about it so much anymore. But the whole goal of WTO is to lower trade barriers between countries so that goods can flow more smoothly from one place to another. But neoliberals like that, typically. I can't speak for every neoliberal, but I certainly can say in a general sense, they favor that. Okay, now I want to talk a bit about this case study. I want to shift to the case study. Proliferation and arms races. Okay, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, or what's known as the NPT, is the most comprehensive attempt to prevent the horizontal spread of nuclear weapons. Numerous treaties, from SALT to New START, which I'll talk about in a few minutes, entered into by the United States and the Soviet Union or Russia, because after the Soviet Union dissolved in 1991, I remember that. Remember when the Berlin Wall came down, I remember when that's 89, and then in 91 when the Soviet Union dissolved, and then you had to break up into these separate countries, and Russia, of course, is the most dominant among them. And you hear about Russia a lot in the news. But the reason why it's relevant here is because these treaties have been entered into between the United States and the former Soviet Union, or now will be the United States and Russia, or at least when we say now, it's post the USSR dissolving in 1991, if that makes sense. So there's been an attempt, multiple attempts to curb vertical proliferation. Other treaties are intended to curtail arms, like the Limited Test Ban Treaty and the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. I'll talk about those more in a few minutes. How do liberals explain the creation of these regimes and their widespread membership? Well, neo-functionalists and regime theorists, they think they represent attempts to coordinate behavior to solve a problem no single state can solve alone. And that would make sense, because if there's a Cold War, which we had up until, people like to think that the Cold War ended in 91, but you can see there's still tensions between the United States and Russia. Now, nuclear weapons doesn't get all of the attention that it used to at one time, but certainly it is still an issue that is worth talking about, which is why I wanted to talk about it as the case study here from the authors, this other book that I have. So no one state can actually address this problem. Like, what are we going to do? Because during the Cold War, both countries were stockpiling, we were manufacturing these weapons, right? And there was concern there could actually be a nuclear war. And then, so if you're going to address nuclear weapons, then countries need to sit down and talk to one another about the weapons that they have developed and they've deployed, okay? So that's important. In the different systems that they have that are attached to the weapons, right? So neoliberals, the development and use, this is what they think, the development and use of international institutions to coordinate behavior and promote cooperation. Yes. In other words, if they're going to exist, then these countries need to communicate with one another. And they have to find ways, once they've been stockpiling them, they have to find ways to de-escalate this. You can't just say, well, I'm going to abandon my nuclear weapons development, as a country by itself. You want to communicate with others and say, well, here's another option. We are going to get together, we're going to meet, and we're going to try to find ways to cut the number of weapons that we have, right? Because you don't want people, the thought that occurs to me is, or the question I would ask is, at what point does this end? Because you keep on building more and more of them. So being able to sit down with another nation and have that conversation is really important. All right. Confidence-building measures promote good relations that spill over into other areas of mutual concern. So if you already have an established relationship between countries where you're talking about nuclear weapons, you can then expand the conversation to other issues. So that's important. It's like you actually have this line of communication between the two countries. All right, so that's important. Or more. It could involve more than that. It's not just the United States and Russia. Certainly there are other countries that possess nuclear weapons as well. All right, so represents example of how liberals argue the prisoner dilemma can be overcome. This is the cooperative part of it. And the Non-Proliferation Treaty is a significant achievement with multilateral cooperation from 191 members and widespread compliance. And this goes to the point that it's not just the U.S. and Russia, right? Or historically the U.S. and the former Soviet Union. Nuclear weapon states have little to lose by signing the agreement, and their participation gives the treaty credibility. Because when you sign on to it, you're legitimizing it. And when I say treaty, we're talking about the Non-Proliferation Treaty here. Non-nuclear states join to engage in the peace-building measures and avoid being labeled as a pariah state. Because I hate to say it's almost like peer pressure. And there are no perfect analogies, but that's what it makes me think of here. Because if you're the nation or a small group of nations who refuse to participate, then people look at you differently. Well, why don't you want to sign on to this? So there's almost like a peer pressure there. Although while peer pressure is often negative, to me in this context it might be very positive. It can be very positive. Only 5 states are not parties to this agreement. Considerable pressure has been placed on Israel, India, and Pakistan to join. And then there's also South Sudan and North Korea. International Atomic Energy Agency is responsible for providing safeguards against cheating by verifying compliance through inspections to see, like, what are you doing in terms of your nuclear weapons? Like, what do you have available? What kind of technologies are you working on developing? Because that is in a lab. And what are you building? And then where do you place them and so forth? So the inspections are an important component to make sure that people are following the rules, so to speak. All right, so if you sign on to a treaty, you don't just want to put your name on it and then not follow it. Because if an inspection is conducted and there's evidence to suggest that you are violating it, then that doesn't reflect well in this global community. It doesn't reflect well in your country. All right, so neoliberals stress institutions help decrease mistrust and suspicion. And that's true. You create an institution that everyone accepts and that you're a part of. And by simply buying into it, not literally buying into it, but by accepting it and participating and complying with it, then essentially, remember, you're legitimizing it, and then that can decrease the level of mistrust that could exist between different countries. If a state is caught by the IAEA, that is the International Atomic Energy Agency, its reputation would be damaged. And you don't want that. Process of nuclear arms control began between the Soviet Union and Russia and the U.S. to stop and counteract the costly arms race between the superpowers, which was going on up until when I was in high school. Latest treaty is the New START, which is from February 2011. 7 years to meet the treaty's central limits, which is 1,550 nuclear warheads and 700 deployed delivery systems. When I said deployed earlier, that's what I mean, the delivery systems. Both countries complied by 2018. Verification regime is substantial. By verification regime, the process by which we make sure that you are actually adhering to what you agreed to. Here we go. There's short notice with on-site inspections. There's 18 per year. There's data exchanges, the use of national technical means such as satellites. There's an annual exchange and telemetry on agreed number of launchers and so forth. All right, the inspections. These are the one that's probably the most controversial, historically the most contested, yet arguably the most successful, because you can actually have people visit your country and then go and look at what you have available, right? And hopefully no one is hiding any weapons or any technology. Expires in February 2021 unless superseded by new agreement or extended for additional 5 years with approval from both parties. And I will be putting information in the description section below the video if you'd like to read more about any of what I talk about in this particular video. All right, let's move on. So that was the START, the New START. That's the latest treaty. Let's talk about the Limited Test Ban Treaty from 1963. There were 108 signatories, which means 108 different countries signed on to it. Prohibits nuclear tests in the atmosphere, in outer space, and underwater. And if you'll notice, the image that's behind in the screen here that I've chosen, this image, was a nuclear weapon that was detonated in the Pacific underwater. You can see the water coming up as part of this that goes up into the sky. All right. Prohibits nuclear tests in the atmosphere, in outer space, and underwater, as I said. Allowed only underground testing. Some of that's been done in this part of the country, in the United States, even in Nevada. Right. Negotiations lasted 8 years, and one of the biggest roadblocks was verification. So parties were concerned about the clandestine testing. You know, because you can't always tell, is it an earthquake or is it a nuclear weapon that got detonated? When like, for example, the former Soviet Union is rather large. And Russia is rather large. So the question then becomes, if someone is actually testing and it's in such a distant location, if it's so far away, someone could easily say, or a country could easily say, well, that wasn't a nuclear test, that was an earthquake. So that's part of what throws a wrench into this. When we talk about detonating underground, makes it more challenging. So we want people to stop testing, ideally. Now, not everyone's necessarily going to adhere to this, but the countries that don't adhere to it, the ones, the rules here, and the ones that don't sign on to it. All right, rectify omission of underground tests from the treaty. The Conference on Disarmament, this took place in 1994, that began deliberations on a new nuclear test ban treaty. This led to the Comprehensive Ban Treaty, the CTBT, which prohibits all nuclear tests, was finalized, and the United States was the first to sign the new agreement. However, while the United States can sign on to it, the U.S. Senate has to actually approve it, has to ratify it. And we do this as part of our checks and balances system here in the United States. So the United States Senate refused to ratify, and the treaty has yet to come into full force. Requires ratification by 44 specific countries, including the U.S., for it to be real, so to speak. Or maybe you could say that it is real. People did discuss it. It does exist. But whether or not you sign on to it formally, that's another situation altogether. Right? The UN Security Council passed Resolution 2310, introduced by the U.S. in 2016, intended to reaffirm the international norm against testing, and passed the Security Council with a 14-0 vote, with Egypt, the country of Egypt, abstained. Right? The U.S. has not conducted a nuclear test since 1992. And when I was reading about this, I hadn't realized that was, that's the year I graduated from high school. I didn't realize we were still conducting nuclear tests up till that late of a date. I thought we'd stopped much earlier. Because at some point, you just develop so much of a stockpile. You'd think people would just stop. But I guess there's a desire on behalf of countries, at least at that time, for us to continue to develop the technology. So no CTBT signatory has conducted a test since 1996. Now, please keep in mind that India, Pakistan, North Korea are not signatories. They have not signed on to it. Neoliberals would argue that this is a case of norm creation that supersedes the need for a ratified agreement. So if the United States never formally ratified through the United States Senate, you can still create these norms around this issue through these institutions outside of our government that our country participates in, and through that norm creation, then you can actually how do I want to phrase this? You can actually get other countries to buy into these ideas and behave in a way that's consistent with those norms to try to minimize the threat, right? If that makes any sense? In other words, even if somebody doesn't formally sign on to it, you can still create an environment where norms are practiced by countries. Like everyone's looking around and go, okay, well, this is the acceptable behavior, so we want to agree to it as well. And so even in the absence of signing it, you can still induce certain kinds of normative behavior. Let's put it that way. Okay. 2 points I want to make. Even without confidence building measures, and this is according to neoliberals, even without confidence building measures, states are abiding by it, and cooperation possible even without threats of punishment. So, you think about it, you don't necessarily have to have that leverage. If you create these norms that people will accept, they will embrace them, then you don't need to threaten them by saying, well, if you don't agree to this or if you don't comply by it, here's what's going to happen to your country as a result. So it's really, and I think ideally that's what you would want to do, creating an environment where people behave in a certain way without, the risk of or the threat of having to punish anyone. All right. Implementation and adherence to stipulations are not without problems, and this is what we're going to end with. States have been known to defect by violating provisions, and lastly, condemnation and sanctions have followed in some cases. This is North Korea, this has been going on in more recent years, and then Iraq prior to the war where we forced out Saddam Hussein, which was back. That was a resolution And yes, it was not a formal declaration to go to war, but there was a resolution. That's back in 2003. Okay, so this is where we're going to end. Thank you so much for listening. And of course, as always, send me any emails if you have questions, or drop by office hours, and check the description section below the video for more information if you're interested in learning more about the nuclear weapons issue in this global community. Thanks. Peace.